I've probably seen a cartoon or maybe a few different cartoons that are of the same piece. They depict a wise old guru who has he's perched serenely on a high mountain top. Not a clear location, maybe Peru, I don't know. But a traveler, apparently on a pilgrimage to see this guru, is clambering up the steep slope, arriving at the feet of the wise one. And the seeker asks, "Oh, guru, oh, wise one, what is the meaning of life?" And depending on the cartoon, on the version of the cartoon, there are a lot of variations on how the guru answers that question. I saw one several years ago, and the guru responds, "Have you tried Googling that?" So I thought I would. And if it turns out if you do Google that question or ask Siri or Alexa or Chat GPT, the response is never a simple answer. Google, for its part, says there are many different views on the meaning of life, including survival and reproduction. So that's from an ecological perspective, I guess. Coherence, which would be trying to make sense of why things happen. And that's for those who desire for there to be a reason behind everything. Uh, Another meaning of life is realizing your potential or significance, or what is the value of life. Evolution, which takes into account that we're still evolving as a species towards some form of perfection, maybe. Seeking wisdom and knowledge could be the meaning of life. Doing good, either doing the right thing or helping others. And the meaning of life could be love and enjoyment, which could mean loving others and being loved and just enjoying life itself. At least that is what our friends who work at Google have to say about it. So it must all be true. The sheer variety of answers to that question points to at least a couple things, I think. How it's answered depends on why we're asking the question. And regardless of why we're asking the question, it demonstrates that it's a question people have been asking for a very, very long time. So for the sake of not being here all day, we should narrow our search criteria just a little bit. Let's eliminate survival as the meaning of life, survival and reproduction, and evolution, not because those things are not important, it's just that hard science is not something we usually feel we can dive into at church in any qualified way. I'm interested in the question, what's the meaning of life? Because in one way or another, it's something people tend to ask me as a philosophical or as a religious, spiritual inquiry. And maybe because it's a question I ask myself from time to time, especially as I'm attempting to answer that question for somebody else. It's usually posed to me as, what's the point of our existence? Why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? Is there meaning to any of this, or are we just all running around from one thing to another until we die? Is this all that there is? We all can ask a variation on that at some point or another, and quite often we ask it in those moments when something significant is going on, something's changing. We're in a moment of transition. Maybe we feel like we've lost something and we're not sure what the future holds. So it could be a job, it could be a relationship. Our mobility, that's a big one. Something we could depend on is shifted beneath our feet. We've been going along through life merrily enough, playing with a decent hand of cards, and we suddenly lose all of our kings, queens, and aces. Or maybe there's been a gradual accumulation of small events that cause us to reevaluate life's meaning and purpose. So we can search for answers. We wonder, what should we be paying attention to here? What's most important? Now, a lot of folks reading the Gospels, they might point to the stories of the death and the resurrection of Jesus as the most important thing we should pay attention to about his life in the gospel stories, as the reason above all others that Christianity even came into being in the first place. Well, I think they're right about one thing. The Easter story is obviously important to our understanding of who Jesus was and is, and our relationship with the God of the universe. So much emphasis is placed on the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. And by the way, I'm not suggesting we don't do that, but so much of our focus can be on that story or set of stories that we can think of everything else that Jesus ever said or did as only being a prelude to that event, and so of far less significance. But I don't think it's as cut and dried as that. In my view, it's impossible to neatly detach anything reported about the life of Jesus from his death and resurrection. It's really all of a piece. The reason resurrection stories are so important is because it's a safe bet that the Gospels were, in a way, written in reverse, with the ending, the resurrection, as the goal in mind from a storytelling perspective. So, looking at it that way, we can see any story or saying of Jesus through the lens of resurrection and what resurrection means. For instance, any story where Jesus heals somebody, if a person's sight is restored or if they can walk again, that's a new kind of life. If you think about it, and resurrection is certainly a new kind of life. If a person listening to Jesus speak or tell a parable comes away with a new perspective about the nature of God, well, that's also a new kind of life, a new way of navigating the world. In a significant way, that person has experienced a resurrection, the death of an old way of seeing things and the birth of a new way of being in the world. Now, the problem with that way of thinking about what resurrection means is that we've so often been taught that the only way to think about resurrection is to see it as the power of the spiritual world over the physical world, a dead man brought back to life. I'll never forget an interview I saw on national TV many years ago. You may remember this. An archaeologist had been working in Jerusalem and discovered an ancient ossuary dating from the first century, the era when Jesus lived. Now, an ossuary is a stone container about the size of a large shoebox. In ancient days, about a year or more after someone had died and was placed into a tomb, and after their flesh had completely decayed, the person's bones would be collected by their family members or friends and placed inside of an ossuary. And then it would be reburied or placed in another tomb. So the ossuary this archaeologist had dug up had an inscription on the outside of the box of the name Joshua, son of Joseph. Well, now in Aramaic, the common language at the time of the first century, it was Yeshua. In English, that's Jesus. So it was hailed as quite a discovery. The burning question was, did this ossuary once contain the bones of the Jesus, the son of Joseph, the crucified man whose followers claimed rose from the dead in bodily form? Now, this ossuary was completely empty. It only contained some dust, but that would not be unusual for something that old. The unusual part was that someone had bothered to inscribe it with that name, which would have meant that if it was the ossuary of Jesus of Nazareth, well, then the gospel accounts of his death and resurrection were all wrong. In other words, it would mean that Jesus did not experience a bodily resurrection. So the interviewer asked the archaeologist a question, but it was really more of a statement. He said, now, if this box once contained the bones of Jesus, then that means Christianity is just a fraud. Even though that question was the reason the archaeologist was being interviewed in the first place, he responded by pointing out that the name Joshua or Yeshua or Jesus, that was one of the most common names anyone had in those days. Today it would be like the name Mike or Bob or John. So the name Yeshua on the box didn't prove much. Even the name of the father, Joseph, didn't prove much either for the very same reason. Very common names. The archaeologist equivocated. He doesn't claim that the ossuary once held the bones of the Jesus upon which Christianity is based. At the same time, he must have known full well that's what people would assume. Now, later it turned out that this particular ossuary was a hoax. On closer examination, it was for the author itself was genuine. It was from the first century AD or thereabouts, but the inscription had been made just a few years before it was discovered, and it was doctored up to appear to be ancient. But that whole episode and that controversy points to a bigger question. The assumption being made by the interviewer and a lot of people was that if the physical words of Jesus were to ever be discovered, then the whole foundation of the Christian faith would crumble. I disagree with that. I don't think it would disprove Christianity in the least. I know full well the Orthodox belief that Jesus was raised physically from the dead, and I make that claim every Easter very honestly. Who am I to say he was not raised from the dead? But I also believe that if the bones of Jesus ever were discovered, as unlikely as that would be, it would not make one bit of difference to my Christian faith. I don't believe Christianity would suddenly be a sham. I don't believe our faith and the way that we live our lives and our journey together to explore the meaning of life should ever be based on the physical evidence of some ancient bones or the lack thereof. The earliest Christians believed and taught that Jesus rose from the dead, and so have 2,000 subsequent years of Christians, and we proclaim that every Easter just like clockwork. And today is All Saints Sunday. Part of that observance is to give thanks for the saints in our lives, but part of it is to affirm that those saints continue to exist in a spiritual way, both in our hearts and in the embrace of God. Try proving that claim or disproving it. Good luck. No physical evidence or the lack of physical evidence could disprove the love that I have for the saints in my life. But far more important than any physical evidence, the bigger question for me is, why? Why do we observe Easter? And why do we observe All Saints? And why do we affirm that when a loved one has died, that they continue to have a spiritual existence? Why do we believe that we somehow, in some way that we can only begin to fathom, will exist beyond this little sliver of time that we call a life? Why did the resurrection of Jesus happen in the first place, and why was the story told about it? What's the meaning of that? Was it to proclaim that life is more enduring than death, to state that we have hope for a life beyond this one, to insist that love is more powerful than anything? I would say yes, indeed, to all of that. But the question every one of us can wrestle with, some of us more than others, is what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to make of the life that we have right now? What is the meaning and purpose of this life? I find it hard to imagine that in God's infinite wisdom, our ultimate meaning and purpose in life is to wait around for our death, or even to be all that concerned about it. That would seem to me to be a terrible waste of time, talent, and energy. And we don't like to think about it much, but we all know that death is inevitable. So if we already have the promise that death is not the end of our story, then what are we supposed to be doing in the meantime? What is our meaning and purpose? And that's why the death and the resurrection of Jesus points us directly back to the conversation in the passage that John read today. And why it points back to practically every gospel story about Jesus. Because what we heard today is the reason we believe Jesus lived and died and continued to exist beyond death. Jesus is telling us the meaning of his life. And across the centuries, he's making an invitation to you and me to share in that life. And through sharing in that, to begin to discover why we are here. Now, the nice thing is, it's not rocket science. And I know some of our members are indeed rocket scientists, quite literally, so I've got to be careful when I say that. But it does involve some simple arithmetic. And in today's passage, Jesus lays it out for a scribe who's asking a first century Jewish version of what's the meaning of life. Now, the way the scribe puts it is to ask, which commandment matters the most? A commandment's a loaded word. We can think of it as a law to be obeyed. But in the context of this conversation, it's more like a way of being in the world. A commandment's not just a rule to live by, it's how you perceive reality and how you act on it. It's how you journey through life. And it's important that in the larger context of this story, the scribe has just interrupted Jesus as he has been debating some Sadducees about, guess what? The resurrection. About the very possibility of resurrection as a concept. About whether or not God creates a life that transcends this life, a life after death in some kind. And then comes this friendly scribe asking about the meaning of how and why we live this life. And Jesus responds with a formula the scribe already knows, but it's one that he really hasn't unlocked. Part one is love God with all of who you are, however you may perceive God. And let's be honest, we all think of God different ways. For some people, God is a lot like a Santa Claus figure or a heavenly accountant, keeping track of who's been naughty and who's been nice. If that is your idea of God, we should talk. For others, God is like a loving, patient, forgiving, welcoming parent. Some of us see God as a force of creativity, always creating and recreating. Some of us understand God as more of a presence, perhaps a cosmic weaver creating a fabric of love that knits the universe and all of humanity together. I kind of like that. But whatever your concept of God may be, or if your image of God is still evolving, that's perfectly okay. Mine has evolved a lot over the years. Jesus tells us to love God with all of who we are, our whole selves. Not out of fear, not out of duty, not out of obligation or habit, but to love God freely. Because why not? Why not believe that there's a force for good and truth and integrity and forgiveness and acceptance and love, a power that binds us all together and that we can count on to see us through, especially in those moments when we find ourselves at the end of our rope? Why not believe that in a world filled with divisiveness and ugly politics and violence, why not believe that what we have ahead of us this week, what we have ahead of us this week and beyond, why not believe that we are ultimately stronger and smarter and more united and resilient and loving than any fears we may be carrying? And that the source of our strength and our smarts and our unity and our love comes from God, who knits us all together in a beautiful interconnected web. So part one of the equation is love the God who makes that a reality. Part two, it's a little trickier. It's where most of us struggle. It's where the rubber meets the road, where we have to walk our talk. Love your neighbor as yourself. Let's face it. It's very, very hard. It's very hard to get out of ourselves. Our needs, our perspectives, our bias, our first impulse is often self-preservation. Not everyone's like this, but my life is largely about me. I exist in this body, this self, this perspective, this bundle of experiences that is uniquely mine, and doing what's best for me or most gratifying for me is at the top of my priorities. I want things to go my way. That's why we always find it really remarkable when we hear stories of soldiers sacrificing themselves for their comrades or first responders rushing into harm's way to rescue a stranger. Those stories are incredible precisely because they point to an essential quality that we possess. But it's not always at the top of our priorities. It's always called upon. We know that those heroes are setting aside themselves, their very existence. Think of someone else. And that is what Jesus is asking to do when he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Daily lives, most of us, thankfully enough, are not usually required to run into buildings to rescue people, but they also were not required to do that every day when Jesus spoke those words. No, they were being asked to grasp the meaning and purpose of life, to make the kind of small but significant sacrifices that cross our field of vision every day, to get out of ourselves and beyond ourselves and over ourselves, to glimpse the bigger picture that God loves and cares about that person over there, that person who's hurting and afraid and lonely and broken, much God as God loves and cares about me. God cares so much about us that resurrection goes way beyond something that ever needs to be proven with some ancient relic. It's proven because we navigate life with the belief that love is more powerful and enduring than anything, even death. So the real question becomes, if we have that vision about our relationship with our neighbor, then what are we going to do about it? And do is the operative word. Rather than pondering the meaning of life, we're called by Jesus to ponder less and to do more. Because it's in the doing, in the loving unselfishly as we need to be loved, that we'll come to the solution of that arithmetic problem. In the doing, that's where the meaning of life comes into sharp focus. We don't need to climb any mountains or ask any gurus what they think. Because in doing good for others, we've already found the answer down here on the ground where it matters in this life. And to me, that's the very essence of Christianity. It is not a faith that's so much about believing in the right things. It's all about doing the right things. The year before I went to seminary, I was conflicted. I was asking myself lots of questions about the meaning and the purpose of my life. Some might call that navel gazing. Why am I here? What's the point? Am I on the right track? I was insecure, worrying a lot about what plan God might have for me. So I visited an old minister friend of mine for his advice, and he'd been a minister for decades. And I thought he had all the answers. He was my guru. I described my dilemma to him, and he listened patiently. And after a long silence, he said, "Do you love God?" I said, "Well, yes, of course." He said, "Well, then you need to get over yourself real bad." He said, "Do you think the world revolves around you or depends on you to save it? Can you possibly be more conceited? Do you think you're the only one out there with problems?" Now, I thought this guy was my friend. But here he was reading me the riot act. He said, "You are only going to find out the meaning and purpose of your life by getting out there and simply being the best David Green you can be. So buck up and just go and do it and stop wasting your precious time and mine by asking all these silly questions." And then he gave me a big hug. It was the best advice I ever got. Maybe the best lesson I ever learned. That if we're ever asking what's the meaning of life, what's the point I hear, we're asking the wrong question. The right question is, how can we best love this God and this life that we have been given? In this precious, fleeting moment in time that we have, what can we do? And the answer is, get outside of ourselves. Give ourselves away for something larger. And do whatever it takes, simply to love someone else. Amen. Now we're going to have a stewardship moment with Lisa.